Quackity's character is becoming more and more important with every passing stream on the Dream SMP, and his character can get a little confusing from time to time. That's why in this video I'm going to be explaining Quackity's entire lore on the Dream SMP, from the start till now when I'm recording it, with no fluff, no nonsense, only the lore and stuff that you will need to know for the next few Dream SMP arcs. This video is also my first ever sponsored video, and wait, I know, you're skipping ahead as we speak, but sponsors like today's will help me do what I want on this channel and bring you content that's new and fresh, like the song I made or the undercover clips channel video, while having to worry less about the algorithm and time constraints. If you guys can show these companies that it's worth their time to sponsor me, I'll be able to make better and better content and get better deals with these massive companies to make sure that even sponsored videos like today's aren't that much of a pain. With that out of the way, a big thank you to Dragon City for sponsoring today's video. Dragon City is free to play and available on both Android and iOS, but it's also available on Windows and Amazon for you PC gamers out there. Collect over 1,000 different dragons and build your own Dragon City in the game, where you can breed 2 dragons to get new ones and feed them to evolve. You can train your dragons and take them to battle in order to make them more powerful, and there are different PvP modes that let you fight against your friends and challenge other dragon masters. There are tons of events every single week to discover and play new adventures, and you can also find some of your, I'm pretty sure they are, your favorite YouTubers in Dragon City, like Dream and George Not Found. And I'm just saying, you can breed dragons. Dream and I'm just saying. Anyway, click the link in the description and get a special free reward of 15,000 food, 30,000 gold, and the extremely rare Thief Chief Dragon, which will be available for new users from 7 days until July the 1st. You have to make sure you have the latest version of the game or you won't get the reward. Thank you guys so much for putting up with this, because again, it really does help the channel out a lot. And once again, a massive thank you to Dragon City for sponsoring the channel and letting me do what I want to, you know? It like helps me, gives me creative freedom. So yeah, thank you. Okay, cool, let's get started with the actual video then, shall we? Quackity joined the SMP back in August and was shown around by Tommy, who he had previously been canonically guiding from prison in what they called the cartel. Tommy then discovered that Quackity had a condition which made his neck turn yellow, and though this isn't important plot-wise, it is brought up later and therefore is canon. After this though, Quackity faded into relative inactivity in the lore and was barely seen on important streams. That is, he was barely seen until Wilbur and Tommy, thinking him to be trivial and not involved, told him of their plans to hold an election and told him that they would run in a one-party election to solidify their rule over L'Manberg. However, Quackity, displaying his first and one of his only moments of moral integrity, formed another party solely for the idea of not having a one-party election and giving the people of L'Manberg someone to vote for if they were unhappy with Wilbur and Tommy's rule. His running mate was George Not Found, which would prove to be incredibly faithful, and it was also revealed later that at this point, Wilbur and Quackity talked, and Wilbur tried to warn Quackity of the need for violence to obtain power, but this only really becomes relevant later. Then, on election day, the least planned and most harped on moment of the SMP occurred. George Not Found, Quackity's vice president, his running mate, the one man who was integral to Quackity's party called the Swag Party, slept through the election. Devastated, Quackity decided to cut his losses. Schlatt, who had entered the race last minute after being introduced as an endorsement for Tommy and Wilbur and then just running on his own, was almost guaranteed to lose at this point, but Quackity realized that since Schlatt was an independent, since he had entered so late, he would be easier to win over than a group of 2 people like the only other party, Coconut 2020, which was led by Fundy and Nikki. Thus, a Swag and Schlatt coalition was formed, with Schlatt as the leader, and although Quackity had more political leverage in terms of pure votes, because Swag was slightly behind Pog 2020, because Schlatt's votes might decide the election, Schlatt managed to wrangle the position of president if they won, while Quackity was relegated to vice president. I'm sure you know what followed suit. The Swag-Schlatt coalition won by just 1% of legitimate votes, making Schlatt the new ruler of L'Manberg. Schlatt's first decree as president was to revoke the citizenships of Wilbur Soot and Tommy Innit, forcing them to run to the wilderness. The two then formed Pogtopia and allied with Technoblade to try and regain their control over L'Manberg, which Schlatt renamed to Manberg after tearing down its iconic blackstone walls. While he was a part of the Schlatt administration, Quackity was initially starting to get convinced to rebel by Nikki, who was an outspoken critic of Schlatt's regime, and things were looking up. Then, however, Quackity was accidentally killed by Nikki, reverting all of her progress in converting him and turning him hostile towards the dissident, because of which Quackity reported Nikki's actions to Schlatt. When reporting Nikki's views to Schlatt, the president decided that she was to be locked up in a cage, a makeshift prison at least, as penalty, which Quackity disliked. So he and Eric then worked together and broke Nikki out. Not much happened after this, with Quackity at least, until the Great Festival of Manberg, which you can catch yourself up on with the video in the card, and during the festival, Quackity and Schlatt were both killed via Techno using a firework to execute Tubbo, after Tubbo was uncovered to be a spy in the Manberg government, and Schlatt peer pressured Techno into killing Tubbo. Afterwards, Quackity expressed a dislike for Tubbo's public execution as a spy, and it was later clarified that though Quackity and Schlatt died here, those weren't canon deaths. This started tensions rising, which only grew thanks to Schlatt constantly calling Quackity Flatty Patty, and which peaked when Schlatt said that he wanted to tear down the White House. Since Quackity had helped build the White House in the early days of Manberg while the election was still being called, before Schlatt's rule he had an emotional attachment to the building, and this led to a major argument between the two. This argument led in Quackity assassinating Schlatt and resigning as vice president, and later running to Pogtopia and joining their ranks. Quackity and Wilbur, who was leading Pogtopia, came up with a plan. Quackity would go back to Schlatt with a building contract and ask for permission to build a hotel in Manberg. Schlatt, who would just think that Quackity had not been fit to rule, would accept the contract without reading the fine print at the bottom, or the end of the book in this case, which would transfer all power over Manberg from Schlatt to Quackity. Schlatt, however, ignored this offer and, even after discovering it, changed the topic to TNT that he had discovered underneath Manberg and his podium, which Wilbur had previously planted, and blamed that TNT on Quackity. Thanks to this pressure, Quackity had to be evacuated by Wilbur using an arrow of invisibility given to him by Punk. There were then further developments in Pogtopia, but they're not relevant to Quackity, so I'm not going to go in depth about them. Quackity then fought valiantly in the war against Manberg, and when the army found and killed Schlatt, Schlatt's last words were addressed to Quackity, calling him Flatty Patty once again. This angered Quackity, but undeterred, he attended Tubbo's inauguration as new president and deemed himself the Secretary of State. Manberg started getting rebuilt, and on the day of Schlatt's funeral, Quackity said that it was his plan to resurrect Schlatt to use as a political puppet. Nothing came of this for a while at least. After this though, Quackity was promoted to acting vice president of the newly renamed Manberg, after the previous vice, Tommy's actions and their consequences on Manberg were called into question by Tubbo. While Quackity was the acting vice president, he built a dirt platform in the sky with a few other members of the SMP and called it Mexican Manberg. It was around this time that George was being dethroned as king of the SMP, which is a whole other story and isn't hugely relevant to Quackity, and Quackity, sensing an opportunity for political gain, heavily opposed George's deposition and then tried to frame Eric for killing Carl in an attempt to get Mexican Manberg officially recognized. He was called a terrorist at this time, but managed to negotiate this recognition anyway while having to change the name of Mexican Manbergs to El Rapids, leading to this iconic clip.
Alright, check this out, baby! Check this out! I am just chilling! It's Cedar Rapids!
Cristiano Ronaldo
After this, Quackity went back to Manberg and helped form the Butcher Army, a coalition of Manberg allied players who sought revenge against Technoblade for the crimes he had committed against Manberg. This led to Filza being arrested and put under house arrest, while Techno was captured using his horse Carl as a hostage. Technoblade managed to escape this execution using a totem of undying, and was given back his horse by Dream, setting up an animosity between Dream and Quackity. While chasing the now escaping Technoblade, Quackity managed to corner him in a cave, which led to this famous line.
I have a pickaxe, and I'll put it through your teeth!
Which was followed by, well, a pickaxe being put through Quackity's teeth. This anger brewed inside Quackity and caused him to ask for Tubbo to execute Ranboo at the Green Festival later, but Tubbo, who had already been publicly killed at one such festival before, refused, which led to Quackity abandoning Manberg, and he even managed to get a glance at Ranboo's memory book as he left, after singing the Manberg national anthem with Bosper, Tommy and Tubbo for the last time. The last part of Quackity's story starts with Bad Boy Halo introducing him to the egg. Although he was initially swayed by the egg's power, a message from Carl in in-game chat snapped him out of his trance, and scared at the power the egg had over him, Quackity told Bad that he would never trust the egg again, and further that Bad was putting the whole server in danger by consorting with the egg, vowing to foil his plans. After this happened, Tommy was killed in prison by Dream. This led to Quackity trying to force Sam to kill Dream, even managing to manipulate him into putting on his armor and reaching the prison. Once they reached the prison, however, Sam came to his senses and refused to kill Dream, further getting a little annoyed that Quackity was pushing so hard for him to do so. Big Q apologized, and later he even found Tommy after he was revived by Dream, giving him a random clownfish. After this, Quackity started to try and make good on his promise to destroy the egg, and he placed stacks upon stacks of TNT around it in an attempt to blow it sky high. Before he could pull the trigger, however, he was accosted by Bad and Punts, who started threatening him. Undeterred, he set off the TNT anyway and somehow managed to survive being in the thick of it, though he was severely injured and only just managed to stagger back to his base. It was also just after this that Quackity learned from George Not Found that all the other members of L Rapids, Carl, George, and Sapnap, had started a new kingdom called the Kanoko Kingdom and hadn't even bothered to tell him, let alone invite him. They had left him out of his endeavors, and this clearly hurt Quackity. This isn't the most plot relevant right now, but it may become plot relevant later, so I'm mentioning it here. And then comes the biggest part of Quackity's latest era of lore, the reason why he's so important to the plot: his advanced interrogation of Dream. Before we get to that though, we have to get the starting point, the spark for what made Quackity actually go to the prison for Dream. You see, Quackity was at a cow farm in a location unknown and found a random book hidden in one of his chests. Following the instructions in the book, Quackity was led to an underground gym where Glat, or the ghost of Schlatt, was residing. The two argued, and Quackity eventually ended up losing a bet in which the stakes were that if Quackity lost, he would be forced to revive Schlatt, finally follow through with the plan he had made all that while ago, finally bring back the old leader of Manberg. This then tied into another thing I mentioned earlier, Quackity's dislike for Dream. Quackity realized that since Dream had revived Tommy, as he had learned earlier from Tommy wandering around after being killed, Dream must have the famed revive book that had been just a myth on the server up until then. And so Quackity, with a lot of manipulation, leverage, and a tad of the good old emotional blackmail, managed to convince Sam to let him interrogate Dream with netherite tools, an axe and a sword, and also with shears every single day. This continued on in the background, becoming part of Quackity's daily routine, but also making him get annoyed of doing that same thing, and in his spare time, Big Q finally, symbolically, tore down what remained of L Rapids, vowing to concentrate fully on the new country and new casino that he was making with Sam, called Las Nevadas. He also finally rode back to Wilbur's grave, remembering the advice that the old leader had given him all that time ago, and left him a thank you note. Very quickly, Las Nevadas is a new nation Quackity and Sam are starting, which will mainly run on money generated by their huge and one-of-a-kind casino. They plan to lure people in and get them gambling and use that money to further their political exploits. Then, Quackity's plans kick into action. First, he completely foiled the Red Banquet, stopping the egg in its tracks with the help of Reconciled Technoblade and Purpled, and most importantly, waiting to derail the festival until Foolish Gamers had been killed, to try and prove a lesson to the Shark Totem God. Quackity then went to Foolish's home afterwards, and with a mixture of emotional blackmail and the silver tongue that he developed so well, using the fact that he had let Foolish die in the festival to make him emotionally vulnerable, he convinced Foolish to join Las Nevadas. A similar thing happened with Purpled. After paying the mercenary for his help with the egg, Quackity blew up his beloved UFO and, in his emotional trauma, tried to convince Purpled to join. Whether Purpled will join or not is still unknown, and he is the least likely to join as of now. After that, Quackity somehow managed to enter Fundy's dreams, and following the exact same pattern, he used Fundy's past against him to make him emotionally unstable and tried to make him join Las Nevadas. And we even see Fundy arriving to bargain with Quackity later as Foolish leaves doing the exact same thing. The last person that Quackity recruited was Slimecicle, or Charlie, an incredibly old and yet youthful, powerful and yet thick in the head slime with incredible powers and also loyalty to Quackity above all, thanks to a few streams where Quackity gained his trust. I explained Charlie's powers a bit more in this video I've linked in the card and description, so feel free to check that out after this one. After this, the last piece of Quackity's puzzle clicked into place, the last thing that we know that Big Q did. He lied to Technoblade. Techno is Quackity's main threat in getting Dream out of prison, being one of the most wealthy on the server, and one of the most willing to flout rules. Quackity managed to kill two birds with one stone though, and in Techno's latest stream, we see that he lied about a favor that Techno owed Dream from a while back, getting Techno to visit Dream completely unarmored in prison, and getting him stuck in that same prison with Dream, his two greatest physical enemies on the server trapped together, helpless and stuff. I've got some incredibly important stuff for the lore to share now, so stick around because I'm pretty sure I figured out how Technoblade will defeat Quackity's plan. Before we get to that though, I want to really quickly remind you that it would really help me make better videos if you downloaded Dragon City from the link in the description to get that crazy reward and ultra rare dragon. Thanks for bearing with me. Alright, we're back. Thanks for sticking around, and here's what's so important about the lore right now. There are two main things I want to bring up. One, I think that with Techno getting trapped in prison with Dream, Quackity's daily visits to Dream to try and get the revive book from him will finally stop, because at this point they're the only thing that the prisoners could use to get out of the cell. This is huge in terms of ramifications for Dream's character, Quackity's character, and Techno and Dream's characters' views and emotions about each other. Two, and probably much more interesting, I think that Techno already has a plan to escape from the prison. I came up with this theory on my own, but I've also seen it on Twitter and Tumblr quite a bit. But see, if you look at the lore stream in which Techno gets trapped in prison, he has a will, which he gives to Phil before leaving. And knowing Techno, the character who spent 14 straight hours farming potatoes for a war, both canonically and in real life, he's thought this visit out. What Techno's will probably mentions is the Syndicate headquarters, namely the fact that when a button at the headquarters is pressed, thanks to some Ender Pearl trickery, every player who's a part of the Syndicate is teleported back to the base. After a certain amount of time, I think Techno's will tells Phil to press that button in the Syndicate headquarters, thus teleporting Techno out of prison and foiling Quackity's plans once again.